Hey everyone, welcome to Fashion Design with Hannah. Today we'll be going over our fashion forward face mask. You heard me, fashion forward face mask. Boring face masks are a day in the past. No longer do you have to worry about your mask no longer matching the event or your outfit. You can wear a nice personalized mask to weddings, interviews, dates. And don't worry, it's a lot more simple than you think. You just have to use a face mask that you already have, which I'm sure you already do. Alright, so first we're going to need a few things. If you don't have pattern paper, printer paper will do, along with the favorite mask of whatever fits you the best. This one I made for myself back at the beginning of the pandemic. It has pleats in it, so we're going to remove the pleats. If you have one that has just a seam down the center, you can always trace that. Of course, for tracing you need an eraser, a pencil, some sort of marking tool. I prefer a pencil so we can always erase it. Some pins so we can fold the mask, for at least my style. And then a ruler. I prefer my translucent 18-inch ruler, so that way you can see what's going on underneath. So this one has pleats, and that can be a little bit more difficult with nice fabrics. So we are going to expand the pleats and fold it in half. So that way we have the fullness shape that we want. And then we still keep the width down here because this is the width that I like on my face. I'm just going to pin it. This is to make it a little bit easier to trace and keep the right shape. And this side's going to be straight, but I still want to put a pin here just to keep everything in place. Okay, so we have that all pinned. And then if you have pattern weights, this is a great time to use them. I do not know where I placed mine. Alright, so in place of a pattern weight, I have some lotion. So I am going to mark off the corner here. Since I know this is a straight line, I don't necessarily have to mark it, but you can if you want. I'm going to mark the corner down here, and then key points along the edge. Around the corner, so we have this fullness all marked out. And then if you see, without the pattern weight, it can be a little bit different. But here's the general shape that we're going for. Again, this is our printer paper, not exactly pattern paper. It might hold up a little bit better if you want to cut multiples. So for this one, just going to connect along here, as it is a straight line. Connect all the way at the top. And then if you have what's called a French curve, you can certainly use it. If you're just feeling like using only one tool, you can kind of come along here with a ruler. And then just smooth that out a little bit. Or if you're feeling really confident, you can just come along here and fill that in. So there's the initial pattern piece. And you're going to add in your seam allowance. I prefer a 1/2 inch. And then since you want this to be a nice seam, you're going to extend this line here and then connect it down. Then we're going to do our 1/2 inch seam over here. This right here, so you have a nice seam to sew at. It's really easy to line up. And we're going to come along here, do our 1/2 inch. Just along this edge. And we're going to do the same thing that we did on the bottom edge and extend the line so we can get a nice seam to sew on. And then do our 1/2 inch from there. And then connect along that edge at a nice 90 degrees. There you have it, beautiful pattern piece. So this one is the top edge for going along the nose and cheek. This is the bottom edge for going along the chin and neck on some people. And this is the middle seam that goes over your nose and over your mouth. This is the seam that comes along over on the side of your cheek. So this one is going to be cut for if you want it to be all in the same fabric. For me, the fabric that I'm using is a scrap fabric that's brocade. And just personal preference, I don't really like that laying against my mouth, so I'm going to cut the lining fabric. So this one will be cut 2 fabric and cut 2 lining. So you have a total of 4 pieces. Ta-da! Beautiful shape. Ooh. So this lovely brocade fabric is actually coming from a dress that I have yet to finish. It may or may not have been a while since I started, but it will be finished at some point. I hope to be wearing it to a wedding next year, so I have a nice mask and dress combo. So what I forgot to mark was the grain line. The grain line on this is from here to here, and the cross grain is from here to here. So what that means for us is on here, we want the grain to run from here to here. So I'm gonna mark that. Look at this. And we're gonna match that up on the grain line on the fabric, make sure that the right sides are together. Also to note, this line might be a little bit high for some people. So if you want to, you can actually curve this out a little bit and then come up for your straight line. So it still curves over the nose, but this will curve a little bit lower underneath the eye. So another note is when you're sewing on a curve, it's nice to put a notch so you can match them up and know that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. So choose a good halfway point, make a little snip halfway into the seam allowance, and then you have it right there, so you can mark them together. To line up the grain line, you just use your ruler and see where the selvage is and line it up with the line that you put on your pattern piece. And then go ahead and pin and cut. Go ahead and mark the notch on this as well. Now we're moving on to pinning the outer layer together and the inner layer together. Alright, so here's where those notches come into play. We have the outer curve. We want to make sure that they match up. So here's the notch on one side. Here's the notch on the other. And this will also help with sewing later on. Right sides together, do it for the outer layer as well. It is now time to sew those middle seams together. Once those are all sewn up, you're going to notch the seams by cutting small triangles into the seam allowance. You will then also cut one side of the seam allowance in half along the entire seam. This will help the seam lie nice and flat, and it will upgrade the appearance of your mask from homemade to professional. Here's a close-up of the notched seam allowance, and then we'll flip it over and you can see what it looks like on the outside. Then you pin the inner and outer layers together with right sides together. When you get to the seam allowance in the middle, you can either open it like a book and pin that down, or you can put one seam allowance to one side and the other seam allowance to the other, and that's what I'm going to do right here. For placing the elastic, you see that you want it as close to the edges as possible so you can have a nice snug fit. So you're going to measure out the elastic that you like from your favorite mask. You can just walk it along the elastic, mark that out, and then add in your seam allowance. Since I'm doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around, I'm adding an inch total to the elastic. Once you cut one side, you can then walk it out on the elastic and cut out the other side. To get that snug fit, you're going to mark out the seam allowance. I usually use a pin, so we're going to do a 1/2 inch from the edge, and that is where our elastic is going to line up. So we're going to put in the elastic by feeding it in and pinning down one side. Pin that elastic in place, and then walk out the elastic on the inside to make sure that it will not get twisted, and pin the second side. Here's what it looks like pinned, and then you repeat on the other half. Always double check that the elastic hasn't twisted, because nothing is more frustrating than having to undo what you just did and re-sew. Once you are sure that everything's all good, you can go ahead and continue pinning around the pieces. Mark off an area that you won't sew and back tack at the opening so that way it will stay together when you turn it inside out. Here is the area that I left undone, and as you will see, the corners have a little bit of bulk to them, and that is from the elastic being there and extra fabric at the corners. So to take care of that and make the corners nice and pretty, we are going to cut off the edges close to the seam allowance, but definitely not through the sewing line, and I'll show you what it looks like on the outside. As you're turning the mask inside out, be mindful of the opening as it is still a little bit weak. You can use the elastic as a little bit of a handle to help you pull it out. And not to brag, but these middle seams lined up perfectly, so Alright, so here's what I was talking about with the bulky seam. I did not cut these edges so I could show you. And here's what a nice, clean, crisp corner looks like. I'm just going to turn mine back to being inside out so I can trim off those other corners. And then I'll go one step further here and trim off the corners a little bit more. So you're just going to make this as close to the sewing line as you comfortably can make it. If you want to go above and beyond, you can even trim one side of the seam allowance in half, so that way it lies even more flat. Now you can turn your mask right side out and make any final adjustments before doing your finishing touches. You can see here that I'm going to make mine a little bit smaller underneath my chin to make it a little bit more fitted. After the adjustments are made, you can then close the opening by folding the seam allowance back and pinning it into place. Once this is pinned into place, you are then ready to move on to the finishing stitching. To prep for the finishing, pin all around the edges of the mask and leave the lining turned a little bit more to the inside of the mask, so that way it won't be visible from the outside. You will then top stitch around the edge of the mask, which is about 1/4 inch away from the edge. Top stitching helps keep everything in place and gives it a nice, clean look. Here's the mask with all of the top stitching in place. If you want to stop there, you can, but I like going one step further and securing the lining to the outer fabric with a stitch that goes right along the edge. You can either do top stitching or hand stitching. Now, if you want to be a slight dum-dum like me and put on a full face of makeup, just realize that most of it's going to be covered by your face mask, and you don't want to ruin the face mask that you just worked on, don't worry. You can still fix it. Just take tissue paper, toilet paper, napkins, whatever you have, and go ahead, put it in the face mask. You can rearrange it once you have it on, and no one will really care. It's awesome. I'm sure as long as you're showing up with a face mask, most people will be very happy. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment below on what you'd like to see in the following video. Bye!